Good evening. Welcome to all of you, both the people who are here in the freight shed live in person and to an audience on our Zoom cameras. Thank you all for coming and joining us. I have a few comments to make. To the Zoom people, I have to tell you, it's a gorgeous night here at the freight shed and Bath on the Kennebec River, and our ship is sitting out on the water. People have been looking at it. We appreciate all of the people that come by here, and we'd certainly like you to keep coming down. So some of you Zoomers, come on down and visit us in real life at some point. This is the second in the series of our summer lectures. I want to read to you our mission. Maine's first ship is dedicated to building and operating, and by that we mean sailing, a reconstruction of a 1607 ship, Virginia. This is a working reconstruction of the first English ship built in North America. It serves as a springboard to help us tell the story of early exploration and the settlement of Maine, the first interactions between Europeans and native people, and Maine's centuries-old connection to the sea. We respectfully acknowledge that we're in the homeland of the Wabanaki, the people of the dawn. While we cannot remake history, we can learn from it and move forward with knowledge and respect. And part of that effort begins tonight because 4 of the presentations in our summer lecture series have to do with some aspects of the history or the culture of the Wabanaki community. The ship and the home that you're seeing here, the people who are in person anyway, this building, the freight shed, serves as a foundation for a variety of educational and community activities that we maintain. We're aimed to bringing to light the exciting and little known story of the Popham colony. We have a visitor center, the Jane Stevens Visitor Center, in the back of the freight shed, which will be open after the presentation. Please come by and visit it. There's a museum down there, and you can buy t-shirts and hats and that sort of thing. We have docents that come here right now, Tuesday through Saturday, to tell you the stories of the Popham colony. And you can keep up with our activities on social media and visit our website for online events. So we welcome you to the Maine's First Ship community as a volunteer and as a supporter. From shipbuilding to community building, from academic research to fine art, our Virginia adjacent programs do rely on the financial support of curious and compassionate businesses and individuals such as you. And this 8-part lecture series is made possible through the generosity of the Grill family. So as part of all of this talk tonight, we have Jody Bachelder. She's come to join us. She worked in the Halldale school system in Farmingdale, Maine, first as an educational technician in the library, and then after getting a master's degree as the librarian. And in 2003, she received the Walter J. Taranko Maine School Librarian of the Year. Now she's a full-time author, and she's working on a book about Samoset, and that is the basis, the topic of the evenings tonight. I invite you to come and tell us all about Samoset.
Is Zoom working okay? Great. All right. I'm supposed to look both places, so this is going to be a little tricky. I'll do my best. Thank you, Jim. And thank you to Maine's First Ship for inviting me here tonight. I'm really excited, and I'm really excited about all the lectures that are coming up this summer. There's some terrific ones that are happening, and they're free, so that's pretty great. Oh, now it's not working. It's not advancing. Hey!
How you spell that? I just say, I forgot to say we do have a bathroom here at this end of the hall. It's an important part that was delegated. It's supposed to be
Well, we hope that the slideshow is going to work. First of all, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. If you're actually in Maine right now, then you are on ancestral Wabanaki homelands. And the Wabanaki have lived here for over 12,000 years, taking care of this land and all of its resources. Tonight, I will talk about Samoset, who was from the Pemaquid area, and that was Wawenock territory. Right here in Bath, it's a little bit harder to pinpoint exactly what tribe lived here. It's possible that it was Wawenock or possibly Kennebec. We know that they lived farther up the river. But in any case, I think it's important to know whose land we're living on. Hey, it's working. So I want to tell you a little bit about why I'm here tonight. First of all, I'm not a historian. As Jim said, I'm a librarian by training. And my connection to Samoset, and I'm sure, just realized these people behind my computer can't see me. I can see you if I do that though. My connection with Samoset is that we grew up in the same area on the Pemmican Peninsula. And about 6 years ago, I decided I would write a book about him. I was very naive. This is my first book, and I thought I was going to write a picture book about Samoset because I didn't think there was very much information about him. But once I started doing the research and doing some digging, I realized there was a lot of information about him. And especially once we put him into the historical context, we think that he lived from 1590 to 1653. Once you put him in that historical time period, it's a huge story. There was a lot going on for the Wawenock people. There was a lot going on in Pemaquid. And it was history that I never learned in school. What happened when the English came here to colonize Maine. And I've truly been amazed at all the things I did not know, not only about Maine's history, but about the history of the indigenous peoples who are here. And it's an ongoing process. I learn something new every day. Tonight, I'm just going to give you an overview of the relations between the settlers and the Wabanaki people. But I wanted to say first that I recognize that as a descendant of European settlers who probably displaced some of the Wabanaki, I may not be the best person to tell the Wawenock story. Obviously, I don't have the sensitivity or the knowledge that a Wawenock person would have, but they're not here to tell the story. So I thought it was important to at least start the conversation. I approached this with a great deal of trepidation and caution and humility, I think. But even so, I thought it was really important to ask two Wabanaki historians to read my manuscript to make sure I wasn't too far off the mark. And that was, I asked Chris Newell, who is Passamaquoddy, and James Francis Sr., who's Penobscot. They both offered a great deal of insight, criticism, corrections, which was great. And it made the book better. Hey. Okay, I thought it would be good if we start by orienting ourselves to Wabanaki territory. First of all, Wabanaki means the Dawnland, and the Wabanaki are the people of the Dawnland, or the people of the first light, where the sun rises. And you can see by the map that Wabanaki territory encompasses lands all the way from Vermont in the west to maritime provinces of Canada in the east and part of Quebec in the north. And on the east, you'll see there are the Micmac, and they had a very large territory. And up along north on the St. John River are the Maliseet. Down east, we have the Passamaquoddy. And of course, on Penobscot Bay and the Penobscot River, we had the Penobscot. And they were very close neighbors of the Wawenock. And then you're probably familiar with all of those names. I don't know if I heard that the people in the back can't see all this fine print that well, but on the map, there are some names of other tribes that are west of the Penobscot. Those are certainly not all the tribes that ever existed in the area, but they are collectively referred to as the Abenaki. I know that's confusing, Wabanaki, Abenaki. So technically, you could say that the Wawenock were an Abenaki tribe. And hopefully you can see in the middle of the mid-coast area is Wawenock territory, from basically here, the Kennebec River, east to the St. George River. And their name, Wawenock, means people of the Bay Country, so we think. And they were coastal people, so the ocean was very important to them. The rivers were very important to them. And in fact, they were critical to their food supply and their transportation. And they were experts in both of these things, in extracting the food from their environment and in navigating their waterways. Every once in a while, it doesn't want to work. There we go. So why did the Europeans come to the Americas and feel entitled to take over this land? You may be familiar with the doctrine of discovery, this term. It's the concept which is devised by European Christians that encouraged Europeans to go out to any land that was not already inhabited by other Christians and take that land for themselves. This, quote, permission was given by a series of papal bulls, so edicts by the popes, that spelled out this policy of the right of discovery. And again, I'm using that in air quotes because you don't discover a land where people are already living. But this doctrine said that the Christian right of discovery took precedence over indigenous people's own right to their own land and actually their own lives too. So it was Europeans' justification to go out and conquer and subjugate other people and to build empires. Now, I found this interesting. As far as I know, these papal bulls have never been rescinded. So they are still Catholic law, as far as I know. I know that indigenous people, even today, are trying to get them to rescind those bulls, and they have refused, as far as I know. So I don't know if that technically means the Catholic Church actually endorses the policy or not, but anyway. In 1823, our own Supreme Court used this doctrine of discovery idea in an important case, in a decision, Johnson versus McIntosh, that just allowed them to continue to take indigenous land. And basically, they ruled that the title of land in this country lay with the discoverer, and that indigenous people only had a right of occupancy. That was in 1823. So you've been looking at this picture. This is a TED Talk that I recommend. It's by Mark Charles. He's an indigenous man. And I found it to be, it's only 17 minutes long. I think it's worth your time. He talks about the doctrine of discovery from the indigenous perspective. I think it's really enlightening. He talks about how it influenced the foundation of our country. At the end of the presentation, I'll tell you how to get to the link, and I think they're going to send it out to you as well. So after Columbus sailed west and stumbled across some islands in the Caribbean, other explorers began to find their way to what we now call North America. So they were distracted for about a century by all the great fishing in Canada, but eventually some of them made their way down to the coast of Maine. And one of these explorers was George Weymouth, and you may have heard that name before. He came to Maine in 1605, and he was scouting to find a location to build a colony. And he was also looking for commodities to not only enrich himself, but his investors. He was backed by some investors back in England. So he was looking for things like furs and fish and timber and sassafras, which was thought to be a cure for syphilis and the plague. And now this may have been the first time that the Wawenock actually met European people, though they were probably aware of their trade goods before now, because in Nova Scotia, the Mi'kmaq had already been trading with Europeans for decades by 1605. So they were used to trading for goods, and then they would bring them down the coast to Maine and trade with the tribes here. So the Wabanaki had probably actually seen some of their goods, but they may not have actually seen a European. And we're lucky to have an account of the first meeting of the Wabanaki and the Europeans. And it's written by a man who was on Weymouth's expedition. His name was James Rosier. He published a book about it. And as far as I know, he was the first person to write about the Wabanaki. They met in the Georges Islands, which is in Muscongas Bay. The set of islands is marked on the map by Allen Island. That's the largest of the Georges Islands that we call them now. That was just east of the Pemaquid Peninsula. So Rosier wrote in his book that the Wabanaki were, quote, a people of exceeding good invention, quick in understanding and ready capacity, unquote. So in other words, they were intelligent people. And yet when he goes on to talk about the Wawenock in his book, he calls them savages. Well, that was standard language of the day, and it was done on purpose. Europeans used that term savage when they wanted to dehumanize indigenous people, to make them seem subhuman or less than the European Christian population of Europe. They would use that term anytime they wanted to subjugate people. They used it, they called the Irish savages when they wanted to take over Ireland. So after several days of the settlers and the Wawenock meeting together, they did some gift exchanging, they did some trading, they shared some food with one another, they did some smoking together. I like this detail. Rosier writes that the Wawenock used a lobster claw for their pipe. So after several days of all this friendliness, then the English kidnapped 5 of their men, kind of just like that. And we'll see this in accounts from other explorers where, and they're not nervous about writing that in their accounts. They talk about sort of pretending friendship, doing some trading. When the indigenous people let down their guard, then they pounce and they kidnap some to take home with them. So George Weymouth took these 5 Wawenock men back to England with him, and Rosier includes their name in his account. They were Tahanido, and he was actually the sagamore or the chief of Pemaquid, Amoret, Skikaweros, Manido, and Sasakomwet. Now, these are the spellings from Rosier's book, and those are the spellings that I use, but there are many different spellings of their names in different accounts. You'll see them written different ways. These men were not sold off as slaves like some other explorers did with their captives, or sometimes they would show them on the streets as a curiosity and charge people money for that. But these men were groomed to be interpreters and guides because the English were going to come back to this area to build a colony. So even after, betraying the Wawenock and forcibly kidnapping some of their men, they expected to come back and build a colony, and that these men would help them, and that the native people in this area would be friendly afterward. And this illustration shows you London at that time. It was a very sophisticated city, as you can see. There were probably around 250,000 people living in London at the time. I like to think about what it must have been like for the Wawenock to go there. 3 of the men stayed in Plymouth where they first docked, and 2 of the others were taken to London. And that's just a fascinating story. But it must have been a wonder for them because they're seeing things that they've never seen in their lives. They're seeing multi-story buildings and bridges and horses and cows and people with different skin color. Those things did not exist in their world. But one thing is certain, I wanted to make this point, is that information did not pass in only one direction. Of course, the English were pumping these men for information. They wanted to find out as much as they could about Maine and where they wanted to settle. But the Wawenock were learning just as much about the English as well. They're learning how many people there are and what their strengths and weaknesses are and what their technologies are. And for those people who come back to this country, they are armed now with a lot of knowledge. And their network was vast, and they shared that information far and wide. So these 5 Wawenock prisoners were passed off to 2 men. They were Sir John Popham and Sir Ferdinando Gorges, and you may be familiar with those names. They were interested in building a colony in Maine. And of course, this is the Popham colony in present-day Phippsburg, named for Sir John Popham. Now, the other speakers in this summer lecture series are going to talk more about the Popham colony, so I won't, but I'm going to just give you a little bit of the perspective from the indigenous side of things. But first, I want to share, and you've probably seen this illustration. This is an artist's interpretation of what may have been built at the Popham colony. It was really a remarkable accomplishment, what they were able to build. And of course, you see in the bottom right is the Virginia under construction, And congratulations to Maine's first ship for their terrific achievement. But as for the Popham colony itself, there were problems from the very start, starting with poor leadership, insufficient supplies. They didn't bring enough food, and they had unrealistic expectations. They were expecting to get rich by finding gold and spices here. We know from a journal that was written by one of the men who was on the expedition. He stayed the first few months here. We know from that journal that the Wawenock visited the colony, the Popham colony, at least twice in friendly encounters. I was really surprised to learn that. I had no idea that was going to be the case. And I had to ask myself, after being betrayed by these people, why would they seek out this friendly relationship with them? They're in a position of power. They could have driven the English off. So why didn't they do that? Well, as you can imagine, they had a good reason. And I'm going to take a wild guess that you may not have heard of the Micmac War before, because I hadn't. But I don't think it's an overstatement to say that it was a turning point in the history of the Wabanaki people. I'm sure that warfare was not new among the Wabanaki, but the way that war was conducted after the Micmac War changed completely because of European interference. It's interesting. I don't know if you can read that quote. It's a quote from that journal. And in that quote, we learned that in a random meeting on the Peshipskoke, which we think is the Sheepscot River, the president of the colony, his name was George Popham, he was the nephew of Sir John, was doing some exploring, and he went up the Sheepscot and randomly ran into the Wawenock, who were returning from a battle. And this was a battle in the Micmac War. So we know they were participants in the war. And since this was now 1607, we know that Samoset was probably about 17 years old by now. So he would have been fighting in that war. So the first battle of that war was the Battle of Saco. And as you probably figured out by this illustration, the Micmac pulled out a secret weapon. They had guns. And they had been provided to them by the French. The French had built a small colony at Port Royal in Nova Scotia, and they had provided guns to the Micmac. And it's pretty impressive that the Micmac sailed and canoed all the way down from Nova Scotia to Saco to wage war, but they did. And this battle was a turning point, because before this time, the death count was just not that high when they fought each other. But it's pretty hard to survive a gunshot wound. So this just changed things forever. And that brings us back to why the Wawenock would seek out this relationship with the English at the Popham colony, because they had already been in battle, they had seen what guns could do, and now they needed them as well. So they needed guns to be able to fight against the Micmac. So back to the colony, the Popham colonists struggled through that winter, 1607, 1608. It's colder than anybody could ever remember. Their president, George Popham, died in February, and things began to unravel. The second in command had some less than favorable tendencies toward the Wabanaki, so shall we say, and he began to mistreat them. In fact, they began to abuse the Wabanaki. And the Wawenock, who had been friendly, as we know at the beginning, began to change their attitude towards the English. And they were first helping them, and now they begin to refuse to help them with food and so forth that they need. And we learn this from, there's an account that's written, it talks about the medicine man of the Wawenock says to Tahanado, who was the sagamore, that he needs to keep his people away from the English or they are going to get sick and die. So this is what the medicine man has seen this in a dream, and he tells Tahanado, and Tahanado, it believes what his medicine man tells him, and he starts to keep his people away and refuse help. In fact, George Popham, before he died, wrote a letter to King James that said, they are sabotaging, the Wawenock are sabotaging the colony. I was really surprised to find out how involved the Wawenock were in sort of the downfall of the Popham colony. And that was only one of many things that sort of brought about the end of the colony, but I found that very interesting. So for this and many other reasons, the English decide to pack up at the end of that next fall of 1608, and they go home, and the colony fails. But of course, this was not the end of the English coming to Maine. A year or two later, they came back, but instead of building a colony this time, they switched their focus to fishing. And as long as they weren't building a colony, apparently the Wawenock did not see them as a threat. And they let this pass. The fishermen would come basically for a season, maybe 2 or 3 months. They would come when the fishing was good. And they probably slept aboard their ships and came ashore to dry. This is them drying fish on shore. And they would probably have to gather firewood and water and maybe do some hunting to supplement their food. But apparently these relations were friendly. That makes me think that if some of the Wawenock maybe had gotten sick in 1607, that perhaps they had recovered, and that the Wawenock maybe felt comfortable being near the English at this point. We don't know that for sure. But this was actually kind of a good thing for the Wawenock by now, because they can get trade goods from these fishermen who are coming, who want to do some trading on the side, because they can't get them from the Micmac because they're still at war with the Micmac. So they're getting goods from the English, and this kind of benefits both. So this would have been the time when Samoset really spent a lot of time with the English, got to know them, got comfortable with them, and learned to speak English. But of course, this closeness with the Europeans came at a great cost. The Europeans carried diseases that were unknown to indigenous people, which, as we know, caused a great epidemic. You've probably heard of the Great Dying. It lasted for about 6 years. It's pretty hard to imagine what this trauma must have been like for them. I mean, we've been living in a pandemic, and I think back to the beginning of the pandemic and how scary it was in the early days when we didn't really know about the virus and we didn't know how it was transmitted. I mean, remember that? And how scary that was. And yet, the COVID death rate is less than 4%. It's thought that on the coast of Maine, the death rate was 80%, 80. And of course, the Wawenock had no idea why they were dying. They didn't know what was making them sick. They didn't know how this was spread. They didn't know how to protect themselves. They didn't know how to treat it. So, I just try to imagine how horrific that must have been. And they looked around at the Europeans, and the Europeans were not getting sick. So Native people thought that somehow they had angered their great spirit and done something. And of course, the English thought, our God is doing this for our benefit. He's killing off the savages, clearing the land for us. And they were happy to tell the Native people that as well. So, I mean, this Great Dying had so many effects besides, just the trauma of the death. It caused kind of a loss of culture, in that when so many people in a community die, all their knowledge and their experience and their wisdom dies with them. And so you kind of lose part of your culture. It also undermined indigenous people's belief in their own spirits, their own great spirit and their gods. And the Europeans were happy to exploit that. It caused massive displacement. Some communities must have lost so many of their people that they were no longer viable to live on their own, and they had to go and move into another community. So now, as a result of all this death, you've got this great upset in the balance of power between the settlers and the Wabanaki. So if you think about Pemaquid, for instance, as an example, we know that before the epidemic and the war, there were about 100 people living in the village of Pemaquid. So if there's a death rate of 80%, then there maybe are 20 survivors. And out of 20 survivors, maybe 5 of those are men of fighting age. So now they're very, very vulnerable. In addition to that, you've got these English fishing ships that are coming to their shores every year, maybe 5 or 10 ships a year. And on every ship, you've got at least 15, sometimes as many as 50 men. So now the Wawenock are outnumbered. So if you think about that, I mean, every action, every decision that they make for the next generation or two, they have to think about that until their population can recover. And not only that, the Micmac War is thought to have ended around 1615. So theoretically it was over, but the Micmac kept coming down to the coast of Maine and raiding for years and years after the war. So you've got survivors that are terribly vulnerable. And it's around this time that Samoset, we think, became the sagamore of Pemaquid. So that means that Tohono must have either died in the war or he died in the epidemic. So that means this is kind of an extraordinary time for Samoset to leave. And I was really surprised when I put those pieces together, and I realized that this is the timing of his trip to Plymouth. He leaves in 1619. The epidemic is maybe just subsiding. He's just taken over as sagamore. He's got a lot to deal with. He's got people who are traumatized and vulnerable, and he leaves. He goes to Massachusetts, and he's gone for almost a year. So why would he do that? I had hoped in my research that I was going to find the answer to that. To be honest, we don't know. I do have a theory, which I'll share with you, but we don't know for sure. But there's so much to say about Samoset and Plymouth, but I can't go into all of it tonight or we'll be here forever. But I want to start just by saying that the settlers who decide to come here, the Plymouth settlers, they are working under the assumption that the indigenous people in this country are cannibals. That is what they think. There's a quote by William Bradford, who becomes the governor of Plymouth. And he says that the savages, quote, are not content to kill, they delight in tormenting people in the most bloody manner possible. And actually his quote goes on in much more gory detail than that. And this was the rumor that was going around Europe at the time. So, I mean, I think we have to give these settlers a whole lot of credit for being really brave to come here. This is what they assumed they were walking into. So when they meet Samoset, and he is the first indigenous person that they will meet, they were pleasantly shocked. Here's a man who's intelligent. He speaks their language. He's friendly. He behaves in a very civilized way. And I love this detail. He does a lot of name dropping. So he starts naming off all the English captains he knows. So they're quite impressed that he knows a lot of their kinsmen. Now, Samoset has never really received very much credit for his role at Plymouth, but I'm going to tell you why I think he should. Because it's Samoset who lays the groundwork for the peaceful relations that take place between the settlers and the Wampanoag people. They're the people who live in that area going forward. It's Samoset who does all of that groundwork. According to 2 accounts that are written in which Samoset appears, one was written by William Bradford, the other we think is written by Edward Winslow. Apparently Samoset talked with the colonists for hours on that day. They were asking him, pumping in from information. They're asking him all the kinds of questions, and he is answering them absolutely freely. He tells them what they'd like to know. He tells them he's from Monhegan rather than Pemaquid, because that's a name they're familiar with. That was a very big fishing spot, so that's why he tells them he's from Monhegan. He tells them about the Patuxet people who had died in the epidemic. So Plymouth was called Patuxet, and they were the Patuxet people who lived there, but they had been fairly wiped out by the epidemic. And that's why when they get there, they found no people there. Then he asked for beer, and he ate a bunch of their food very happily. I love it. He just seems so perfectly comfortable talking to these people. He's completely at home with them. In fact, that night they tried to get him to leave, but he wouldn't go. It's a great detail. He won't leave. he won't be brushed aside. He insists on being treated like a guest, like an equal. And I think that's so important. He probably had his reasons for wanting to stay. I mean, it's March, so it's probably pretty cold at night. They've got some nice warm homes. Why wouldn't they share them? But I think he is there because he's gathering intelligence for the Wampanoag, probably. He is probably counting how many people are there, how many are men, what kind of weapons that they have, and he's probably trying to figure out why they're there. So he refuses to leave, and then he does two other things that really begin to build trust with the settlers. They ask him to do two things. They ask him to leave his weapons outside the settlement whenever he visits, and that other Indigenous people do the same. And they had left some of their tools out in the woods when they were working, and the Wampanoag had taken them. They asked Samoset to return the tools. So he comes back. He does finally leave the next day, but he comes back with 5 Wampanoag men, and he complies with both of their requests. They leave their weapons outside the door, and he returns their tools. So he's showing these settlers who are expecting to meet cannibalistic savages that these people are responsible and that they're trustworthy. So a few days later, Samoset introduces the settlers to Usamiquan and to Squantum. You probably know them as Squanto and Massasoit. Massasoit is actually Usamiquan's title. It means great sachem in Wampanoag, which is kind of easy to see how the settlers would get confused. So they meet and sign a treaty of alliance in which they promise not to harm one another and to come, very importantly, to come to each other's aid if they're attacked by an enemy. Now, I started to wonder, why would the Wampanoag do this? They haven't even met these people. The very first meeting, they sit down and they sign this treaty with them. Well, Samoset, as I said, has set the groundwork, and apparently he's made it, he's described this in a way that they feel comfortable with doing this. But also, there was an important reason, because they had suffered great losses in the epidemic and the Great Dying, so that now their numbers were low. But their neighbors, the Narragansetts, who were their enemies, had not suffered in the epidemic. So they were vulnerable to attack. And I think that they felt that making an alliance, an agreement with the English was probably a good way to help protect themselves. They knew that the English had these strong weapons. They probably also thought we should make friends with them before the Narragansett do, maybe. So going forward, they probably saw this as their best course of action to protect themselves. And after this treaty, we don't hear any more about Samoset in Plymouth. And I think that's because he had gone home to Pemaquid. And now here's my theory about why he may have gone to Wampanoag territory in the first place. The next time we're going to hear about Samoset, and I didn't realize this existed before I started my research, but there was another book written by another explorer named Christopher Levitt. 2 years later, he comes to Maine and he meets Samoset, and he writes a lot about Samoset. And in that book, we learn that Samoset has a wife and a son. So I think it's possible that Samoset may have gone south because there aren't that many people left in Maine anymore, and he needed to go to a place that was more populated. So he may have gone south to look for a wife and perhaps maybe other people to bring back to Pemaquid to help him repopulate. That's my theory. Now, I don't know if you can read that. The Zoom audience has got this advantage. They can see my screen very well. So as we move into the 1620s, we'll find that more and more fishermen are coming every year to Maine because the fishing here is great. And also traders are coming now. And that is because the Wabanaki are getting more and more interested in trading. They've come to rely on European trade goods. They're very interested in trading for things like knives and axes and copper kettles, and actually even cloth to make their clothing with, but especially guns and ammunition, of course. And the men are spending more and more of their time hunting and trading, hunting and trapping animals, and the women are processing the hides, and they start to spend less of their time producing their own food. So they're getting caught up in this market economy. Now, if you can read that quote, you'll see that some of their interactions with some of these traders was kind of disagreeable, to put it mildly. This is a testimony by Sir Ferdinando Gorges in front of Parliament, where he paints a really bleak picture of how some of these Englishmen are treating the Wabanaki when they're here. The men are sleeping with the women. They're teaching the native men to drink until they're drunk. They're cheating them, and he gives an example here of they would take a block of salt and they would cover it with butter, and they would try to pass this off as a whole block of butter. And they are selling weapons to the Wabanaki, which by now is illegal. Already by 1622, King James had, made a proclamation, you may not sell any weapons to Indigenous people, but they're doing it. And Indigenous men very quickly become very proficient at using guns, and they become a danger to the English. And in fact, we know from Christopher Levitt's account that Samoset personally has a run-in with one of these rogue traders who beats him up when he says he won't trade with this man. It's another great story about Samoset. It shows his passion. I love it. He goes back to Christopher Levitt and he is furious. And he says, I'm going to go off and kill some English fishermen. And then I'm going to go to England and I'm going to talk to the king himself. And I'm going to complain. So, I mean, his passion is ignited. But when he takes a moment to calm down, he retracts everything he says. And that struck me as extraordinary, because the Wabanaki would normally take care of a situation like this on their own. Somebody does something wrong, Wabanaki justice says, you take care of it, you deal with it. But Samoset is not in a position to do that. We still have this upset in the balance of power, because this rogue trader that he ran up against has, according to Christopher Levitt, this rogue trader has 17 cannons and 50 English muskets, where the Wabanaki have only 2 fowling pieces, 1 pistol, 4 half pikes, and 3 cutlasses among them. So Samoset is tremendously outmanned and outgunned. He doesn't really have a choice. He has to hope that the English will provide justice for him. Unfortunately, that rarely happened, as we'll see. But I don't want you to think that all Englishmen coming to Maine were evil. They certainly were not. In addition to the fishermen and traders who were coming now, by the mid-1620s, you start to have settlers who are coming to stay, which I think is a fundamentally different relationship now. When people come to settle and they're living side by side with the Wabanaki, and they get to know them individually, and they get to, they're now neighbors, they can establish a friendly relationship. They're more likely to do that because they know they're going to spend many, many years with them. And in fact, there are many accounts written by some of the early settlers where they talk about how warmly welcomed they were by the Indigenous people. And even some instances where they work together. They might farm in the same field together. So I get so frustrated and I get sad when I hear those accounts, because it's a glimpse into a world that might have been. There's no evidence that there was any animosity between these early settlers and the Wawenock. They lived together amicably. They lived together in a friendly fashion. And this was possible, but unfortunately, it wasn't going to be. But anyway, one settler who did come to the Pemaquid area in those early days was John Brown. And John Brown is famous for buying 120,000 acres from Samoset and another sagamore, which was basically all of the Pemaquid Peninsula and some of the land that was north of it. Now, there's a lot of controversy about the famous Samoset deed of 1625. So I spent a lot of time trying to decide if it was a forgery or not. There's a lot of debate about that. My conclusion is that I do believe that the deed itself was probably a forgery, because the actual deed doesn't actually appear until 100 years later under some pretty shady circumstances. It's brought for verification by John Brown's great grandchildren when they need to prove that they have a claim to his land. But, you know, it's kind of odd that it never appeared before then. Anyway, there are a lot of other shady circumstances around it. But I do think that it's conceivable that Samoset and the Wawenock would have welcomed John Brown and his family and some of the other early settlers, because there wasn't really any reason not to. There weren't very many Wabanaki people at this point, and there weren't very many settlers in the early days. So there was plenty of land. There were plenty of resources for everybody. And if you think about it, they each had different skill sets and knowledge that could benefit the other. So they probably both thought this was a benefit. And as far as land deeds go, I won't talk much about it, but I'd just like to say that, in my opinion, those early land deeds that Indigenous people put their mark on, something that they couldn't read, my guess is that they probably thought they were just entering an alliance with the buyer. Sure, I'll share with you. You'll share with me what you have and what you know, and we'll work together, and you'll help protect me when I need it. So this worked well for both. Because Indigenous people never expected to leave their land. Samoset never expected to leave Pemaquid. In fact, as far as we know, he lived there the rest of his life, even after selling the land. But unfortunately, the English obsession with possessing land and, you know, accumulating wealth from it will go on to destroy relations between them and the Indigenous people. Basically, they wanted the land and they wanted Native people to be gone. So unfortunately for the Wabanaki, there were more hardships in store in the decades to come, more pressure, more stress. So in 1633 and 1634, there's another epidemic. We know this time it was smallpox because there were a lot of English around who could identify the symptoms. We don't know what the disease was the first time around. In fact, it could have been more than one disease. But this time, I don't think it was quite as deadly, but it was certainly traumatic. And if somebody actually managed to survive smallpox, they were usually left with terrible scars. And sometimes it caused blindness, which would have been absolutely debilitating. And like the first time, the English weren't getting sick, probably because they were exposed to smallpox when they were children in England. So they just have this psychological power over Native people as a result. And they used it to claim that they were superior. They also used it to try to convert Indigenous people to Christianity, because they said, well, you know, our Christian God is killing you because you're heathens. You know, if you were Christians, you wouldn't be dying. So the Wabanaki were also affected by events that are happening in England at the time. The country erupts in civil war in the 1640s. That is an illustration in the center, if you can tell, of King Charles I being beheaded. He was a pretty bad king. He was always taking his people to war and then levying all these really outrageous taxes on them, and then wouldn't let them practice religion however they wanted. So the country erupted in the Civil War. And actually, King Charles I was the only English monarch to be executed by his own people. And the effect here in North America was that there was a Great Recession. Because now King Charles is out of the way, people don't need to leave. The decade of the 1630s has been called the Great Migration, because so many people were leaving England to get out from under his repressive regime. Thousands and thousands of people came in the 1630s. That's when the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay come to Massachusetts. So the ships, now that we're bringing all of those colonists here, they don't need to come anymore because they're staying at home. So also that means that trade goods, there are no trade goods to buy or sell, and it causes a tremendous recession. And it's not a hardship just for the Wabanaki, but it's also a hardship for the settlers who are still here. And in fact, Samoset, we know, sells another piece of land in 1641, which makes me wonder if that was maybe an act of desperation because of the recession, possibly. There might have been another possible reason for it, and that may have had to do with alcohol, unfortunately. Alcohol became a means of manipulating Indigenous people. We saw that in Sir Ferdinando's quote where he talked about them teaching men to drink until they're drunk and how they were cheating them. Of course, it was easier to cheat them if they were drunk. And it was easier to steal their land because you could get a native person drunk and then get them to sign a deed, maybe. And some of the traders would allow native people to buy alcohol on credit at a trading post. There were trading posts here by then. And so then they would run up this debt, and the only way they could, pay off their debt would be to sell land, for instance. So these pressures on the Wabanaki are building and they're mounting. And actually in 1642, it's interesting that there was a lot of talk among the English colonists all the way from Maine to Massachusetts that they feared a great uprising by the native people. John Winthrop mentions that in his journal. He's a big Puritan. They are preparing, they think the native people are preparing for a great attack. So that gives you some idea of how much resentment is going on. Now that uprising actually never happened in 1642, but those frustrations didn't go away. That resentment's always simmering right under the surface until it erupts in war, as you can see. 30 years later in the first Anglo-Abenaki or Wabanaki War, which is King Philip's War. And if you can read those, you can see that they're at war. The English and the Wabanaki were at war for about 100 years, with very few breaks in between. And every time it was the same old story. They're upset by all these encroachments on their land. They're upset by all the cheating and the dishonest dealings. And after every war, they sign treaties, and the English break the treaties, so there's more dishonest dealings there. They wanted to stop this pressure to buy alcohol. There are a lot of times where they talk about that, where they don't want to be under this ruinous cloud of alcohol. They have to follow English laws, but they don't receive English justice in return. And of course, they're tired of being treated like inferiors. So by 1675, the time had come to end the mistreatment. And now they're able to do it because their populations had started to rebound after all these epidemics. Every man now pretty much owns a gun for hunting purposes. So the men are fully armed at this point. And also the Wabanaki have come together in an alliance with one another. The tribes come together. They actually are incursions by the Mohawk in a couple of decades before this. So they came together to fight off the Mohawk, but now they're a unified force and they're powerful. And they get some help from the French as well. Of course, the French are always happy to fight against the English. So, but I found it interesting that when King Philip's War broke out in Massachusetts, most of the tribes in Maine did not want to participate. They didn't want to fight this war. They knew how awful it was going to be. They wanted to remain neutral, and they tried to. But remaining neutral really wasn't an option. For one, the English didn't trust them. When they heard about the war breaking out in Massachusetts, they got nervous, and they forced all Wabanaki men to give up their guns. That winter of 1675-76, this was a tremendous hardship because by now they're not hunting with bows and arrows, they're hunting with guns, and they need them to feed their families. And their people went hungry. And in fact, there's a man from Pemaquid he was in charge of the trading post there. His name was Thomas Gardner. And he actually is one of the few voices of reason among the English. He writes a letter to the Massachusetts governor wherein he says, this is dangerous. You shouldn't take away their weapons because they need them. They're not dangerous. They weren't dangerous before you took the weapons away, but now they are going to be. And he was absolutely right. So they emerged that winter, after that winter, and now they're angry. Some of their people had starved because they couldn't hunt and get food, and they're ready to join that first war. And the map here shows you how the Wabanaki who were living west of the Penobscot territory, who were, as I said, the Abenaki, how they were being dispersed because of the wars. And hopefully you can see by those arrows, they are moving, they have to move out of their territory when they're being attacked by the English during these wars. And okay, confession time. I grew up in Pemaquid, and I have to admit that growing up there are no indigenous tribes in this part of Maine anymore, but I never stopped to think about that. And I never stopped to think why that was. But if you look at this map, you can see that the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac are still living on part of their ancestral homeland, albeit a small part, but they were not as likely to be forced off their lands. And the reason for that is that they were living in territory that was colonized by the French. Now, there were a lot fewer French people, and they were less inclined to push people off their land. Sometimes they actually lived with indigenous people. It was, the English were obsessed with basically clearing this land of indigenous people. They basically weren't happy until they had forced them all off the land. And they did this through a policy of genocide. Now, during that nearly 100 years of wars, the English governments issued a minimum of 79 bounty proclamations, wherein they said they would pay any English citizen to capture or kill Wabanaki people. So these were scalp bounties. And they weren't just for men, they included women and children in these bounties in particular. There was a graduated pay scale. They paid a little bit more for a man, but they still paid a lot for a child under 12. The bounty for a man's scalp was usually around 50 English pounds, which today would be around $10,000. And as far as I know, the highest single scalp price was 500 pounds, which would have been $100,000. So that's a pretty big incentive. And so an English person who didn't really mind getting a little blood on their hands could get very rich by killing Wabanaki people. So the Penobscot people are reclaiming this history of the bounties, and they're teaching it to their children and to the rest of us as well. So I watched this film called Bounty. It's a very short film. I think it's only 9 minutes long. I recommend it. It is the story of a group of Penobscot parents who take their children to Boston, to the old State House where these proclamations originated from. And they tell their children about these bounties. And it's a very moving film, so I recommend it. And the English didn't stop with just the bounties. They, anytime they were at war with indigenous people, they would send soldiers here to commit slash and burn warfare. Basically, they would kill any Wabanaki people they found, but also wipe out their villages and their crops and their boats, anything they could find, basically to make it impossible for the Wabanaki to live on their land. So that's a lot to take in, I realize. And I know that this history is painful, but that doesn't mean that we should ignore it. And I wonder, are we teaching this to our children? I don't think that we are, but I think our children need to know the truth. I think they can handle the truth. I think it's important that we're all working from the same set of facts. And I think it's normal for those of us who are of European descent to maybe feel some guilt or shame about these atrocities. I don't feel responsible for what my ancestors did, But I do feel that we would bear responsibility if we don't acknowledge this, and if we don't learn from the past and improve ourselves and do better, because I think that's the only way that we can make a better future for the Wabanaki, for their children, and for us and for our children. So I just want to conclude by saying that even in the face of such a concerted effort to annihilate the Wabanaki, they have survived. They have adapted over and over to changing circumstances for the last 400 years. They have always been here, they are still here, and they continue to fight to regain their sovereignty, as you probably know. They fight to regain their culture, their language, and the respect that they deserve. So I'm going to put a shameless plug in. If you would like to know more of this story, you can learn about it in my book, which is coming out in August. Unfortunately, it was delayed a couple months because apparently there's still a shortage of paper out there. But it's coming out in August. I have bookmarks though from down east if you want one. So this is more of Samoset's story, the Wawenock story, the story of what was going on with the English and how that affected the history here. And I told you I would tell you how to get to those videos. If you go to jodybachelder.com, there's a page of resources there. And at the bottom, it's got links to those two videos, the TED Talk by Mark Charles and the film Bounty, which you can watch, as well as others, and books and websites and things that I have found really interesting. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jody. I would say that Maine's First Ship is fulfilling its mission tonight. That was quite a story. We are prepared to take questions from the audience, the live audience. We are prepared to take questions on Zoom in the chat, which people will submit. And if they do come in from the chat, I've been asked to read them out loud, or at least to repeat them so that the audience could know that.
We'll repeat them. Yeah, we'll repeat them.
Okay, and well, I have some questions myself. I'm going to hold off and see. We have a hand up, and I'll leave that up to you.
Okay. She's talking about the Upstander project, and that list of dates and that map come from the Upstander project and the Bounty film as well. It's an incredible set of resources. They are working to educate all of us about all of these issues. And they have put together the most incredible guide for teachers. It's fantastic. I hope that there's a way that all teachers can find out about that, because it's extensive. The Bounty proclamations are all there. You can see them, you can read them if you want to. There's just so much information. They've done several films. They did the Dawnland film and many others. So, and they do screenings as well. In fact, there's a screening tonight of Bounty, but thank you for being here instead. But you can watch it, you can watch it online, or there'll be other screenings, but thank you for sharing that. There is a link to that on my list of resources, so yay.
Any other questions from the audience? The question from the audience has to do with whether or not the kidnapping of the 5 Wabanaki were in some way might have been an arrangement with them or an invitation with them to come and participate with the English, as opposed to the traditional physical locks, chains, and in the lower hold. So
sweet talking is the word.
Yeah. So there were a lot of days of sweet talking, but it was a full-on kidnapping. And I really recommend that if you're interested, to read Rosier's account. It's not that long, but it's really interesting. And he gives a full description of the kidnapping, and it is violent. There are 6 men. I love this part of the story, and I wonder if that one got away. One becomes suspicious and he hides. And I wonder if it might have been Samoset, because he would have been about the right age. But anyway, 3 men, they had friendly encounters up until now. And two canoes go out to the ship. They've been doing this over and over. So sometimes they'd stayed overnight on the ships. So they were really comfortable by now with them. So two canoes, 6 men go out to the ship. Let's see if I get the numbers right. Three of the men, I think it is, go on board the ship because they've been doing this all along. They go to sit by the fire and get some food. The others decide to go back to Allen Island, and they have the English have given them some food to take back to the island. And one of them, it's Skikawaros, actually. He gets hungry. He's still hungry. So he said, I'm going back to the ship. I'm going to go see if I can get some more food. So he takes the canoe back by himself. So that leaves 2 men on the island. No, there are 3 men on the island. So only 2 first go down the ship. So now Skikawaros has gone back. He's gone to the ship. 3 men are left on the island. So there's a whole description of them hatching this plan, Weymouth and Rosier, how they're going to get these native men. So they have a trunk of trade goods. They take that over to the island. They walk up this hill, and they're showing them the trade goods all this time. And as I said, one of them got suspicious and ran off and hid himself. So Rosier describes how he's kind of like showing the trade goods and making really loud noise. He's trying to lure that other one in, and he never does. So they finally give the signal and said, okay, we'll have to do with just these 2. So then they grab these 2, and it's a wonderful description because they're just wearing their loincloths and they're slippery and they can't get a hold of them. And they're trying to grab them. They have nothing to grab onto. And in fact, they end up having to grab them by the hair. And he actually writes, we didn't really want to hurt them, but we weren't going to leave without them. So this is a full-on kidnapping. It really is. You're welcome. And Allen Island is beautiful. We did have the opportunity to go out there and see this location. It's absolutely beautiful. So thank you for that question.
Any more questions from the chat? Did the captured Wabanaki learn about the concept of land ownership while they were in England?
That's a really interesting question.
Not that they buy into it, but did they
No,
learn
I don't think
about
so.
it?
I really don't think so. I don't think, we see that Samoset deed of 1625 is supposed to be the first indigenous deed. If it were real, that would be the case. So that was 20 years before. I really don't think so. I don't think that conversation ever would have come up. They were asking them a lot of information. They were asking them things like, where are the villages? Where are the rivers? How many people live in each village? How many men are in each village? So they got a lot of information. In fact, they wrote a booklet about it. It's called A Country of Mawushan. That their territory, the whole territory of the coast of Maine was called Mawushan at the time. And so they document it, but I kind of doubt that they were talking about land ownership. But I don't have any proof for that.
Just say that word again.
Mawushan, Mawoshen.
Where on the Pemaquid, on the Kennebec? No, on the Pemaquid Peninsula did the Wabanaki villages, where were they? Do we know their location?
Well, I have my theories about that. Of course, if you've ever been to Pemaquid, to colonial Pemaquid, I don't know if anybody here has been there. I really recommend it. Yeah. That seems to me the most likely place. There have been lots of excavations that have been done there. They have found a tremendous amount of indigenous, items in the ground that date back thousands and thousands of years. So they seem to have a presence there right up through Samoset's time. So I think that is the most likely place. Also in the journal, the Popham Colony Journal, there's a description of them coming to the village at Pemaquid. And in my mind, that description is best suited to that location. I know that there have been artifacts found at Pemaquid Beach as well. Before I start, I grew up on that beach. I did not even know that they had done digging there, but they have. They have found indigenous artifacts there. They tended to be of a more recent date, so not of Samoset's time. That doesn't mean that they weren't there. They just didn't find any. There's been a lot of development over there, so it would have disturbed, obviously any sites, but So we know that people were there. And there's also a third beach called Fish Point. They may have lived there because the journal talks about them living near the sands, which would have been near a beach. And so there are 3 beaches in the Pemaquid Peninsula.
There's a question in the center there, gentlemen. The question from the audience is, why did the English even bother to offer deeds to the indigenous people if the intention was to? Well, why would they try to get the signatures from, I doubt they were drawn up by the indigenous people. So it's right, get the signatures of the indigenous people on the deeds that were written by the English in order to satisfy some requirements back in England, perhaps?
No, that's such an interesting question. What a question. Very insightful of you, because I was wondering the same thing. So you're probably familiar with that rather famous transaction on Manhattan where supposedly the Dutch buy Manhattan for like the equivalent of $60 or whatever it is. So that transaction supposedly happens does happen in 1626. So that's important because the Dutch are living in the middle of 2 sets of English territories. There's New England and to the north of them and the Virginia colony to the south of them. And they realize they're kind of in a vulnerable spot. But they also know how litigious the English are. They know that they respect the law. And so if you discount the Samoset deed of 1625 as being the first, if it's a forgery, then that Dutch deed, and they do create a deed, would be the first, because they recognize that this is going to give them a legal standing to say we own this land. They know that the English will respect a legal document. And so you're right. I mean, in the Virginia colony, nobody ever thinks to buy land from indigenous people. And the Plymouth settlers never think about doing that either. Why do that? Because, this land has been granted to us by the king, so we don't need to do that. But after the Dutch start the process, they start to think, maybe we ought to just do this to cover ourselves. So that's really where it starts. What a good question.
Yeah. Another question from the audience? Yes, sir, go ahead. Yes, how to summarize that up? Okay, I know you guys at home have been listening quietly. The gentleman spoke about the recognition by individuals that we have our English history of land being claimed and owned by someone, whether it's the state park owned by Maine or his own home in Wiscasset, but that the Indian Native American community and individuals didn't have that feeling. They had a broader understanding of ownership within the group of their extended family and presumably extended relatives as far as that could go. And he pointed out quite clearly and quoted Ladoka in the Ladoka language that this was a entirely different concept, and perhaps we should invite him up to give a talk at some point, because I think we're moving into some heavy stuff in this series right now. So Ken is waving at me for questions from. Ken is waving. He's doing the throat slash, right? Okay, so I'm not sure what the. That's probably not a good. That's not a good indication. Thank you all, Jody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for you. We have a small present for you if you'll get here. Phil Helgerson right here. We have a gift for Jody. This is Phil Helgerson.
For being with us tonight, I'd like to present you with the Maine first chip hat.
This is great. I wanted to buy one of these at the launch, but they were sold out.
Right.
So I'm so happy.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you.
Good job.
Good night.
I'll be back at our little gift shop. If anybody would like to purchase any of our gifts right there
So they have hats
tonight, I'll be back there for a little while.
Yep.
And I have
The store
bookmarks.
is open.
If anybody would like a bookmark, I have one for you.
Bookmarks are open, and if anyone in Zoom is still there, thank you very much. Please
Thank
come
you.
by and visit us in real life.